Berlin, February 1928. Snow dusts the cobblestones outside the Kaiserhof Hotel as Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach steps from his Mercedes, nodding to the doorman who knows better than to acknowledge the steel magnate by name. Inside, behind mahogany doors and velvet curtains, 23 of Europe's most powerful industrialists gather for what their secretaries have logged as a cultural appreciation dinner. No stenographer records their words. No journalist witnesses their handshakes. Yet from this room and dozens like it across the continent, the economic fate of 300 million Europeans will be quietly decided over the next decade. What these men do not yet realize is that they are creating something unprecedented in modern history. A shadow network of capital that will outlive governments, survive wars, and reshape the very definition of power itself. They call it nothing at all. Historians will later struggle to name it, but in the smoky parlors of the Kaiserhof, the deep state is being born. The Great War has ended, but its economic tremors continue to shake Europe's foundations. Industrial production across the continent remains 37% below pre-war levels. In Germany alone, hyperinflation has reduced the mark to less than 1/1,000,000th of its former value. Middle-class savings have vanished overnight. Yet paradoxically, certain men have emerged from this chaos richer than ever. How is this possible? The answer lies not in the visible mechanisms of democracy or the proclaimed ideologies of emerging fascist movements, but in something far more subtle and far more dangerous. Gustav Krupp represents more than just German steel. He embodies a new species of capitalist, one who has learned to profit from instability itself. While politicians debate in parliament and revolutionaries march in the streets, Krupp quietly finances both sides, selling armaments to Weimar Democrats and lending money to nascent Nazi organizations. His ledgers, sealed from public view for 90 years, reveal a startling pattern. The greater the political chaos, the higher his profits soar. But Krupp is not alone. Across Europe, a constellation of industrialists, bankers, and what later economists will call financial intermediaries have discovered that democracy and fascism are not opposing forces. They are simply different management styles for the same underlying system. In Italy, Ansaldo Shipbuilding finances both Mussolini's blackshirts and their socialist opponents. In France, the Comité des Forges secretly funds newspapers across the political spectrum. The Hungarian Bethlen government receives loans from Vienna banks that simultaneously finance Budapest's anti-Semitic movements. Consider the curious case of Ivar Kreuger, the Swedish match king. Between 1924 and 1930, Kreuger lends over $400 million to European governments, ostensibly to stabilize their currencies. Germany receives 75 million. Poland gets 40 million. Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Romania divide another 60 million between them. On the surface, Kreuger appears to be supporting democratic stability, but his private correspondence, discovered after his suicide in 1932, reveals a different story entirely. Democracy, Kreuger writes to his lieutenant in June 1929, requires constant crisis to justify constant intervention. We are not lending to governments, we are purchasing the right to create problems that only we can solve. The match monopolies that Kreuger establishes in exchange for his loans are not merely commercial arrangements. They are mechanisms of control that transcend political systems. When the democratic government of Germany accepts his money, it surrenders sovereignty over a basic commodity. When Hitler eventually comes to power, he inherits these same arrangements unchanged. The political system has shifted, but the economic control remains identical. This pattern repeats across Europe with mechanical precision. In Hungary, the Jewish banking families that right-wing propaganda claims control the economy are simultaneously financing the very anti-Semitic movements that denounce them. It seems paradoxical until one understands the underlying logic. Ethnic scapegoating deflects attention from economic manipulation. Whether the government is democratic or fascist matters less than whether it protects the fundamental structure of capital accumulation. The genius of this system lies in its invisibility. Traditional power operates through obvious channels, armies, police, bureaucracies. But this new network operates through debt, supply chains, and what economists call market dependencies. When the Weimar Republic collapses, most observers blame political extremism or social instability. Few notice that the same banks that financed Weimar's reconstruction also hold the mortgages on Nazi Party headquarters across Germany. At the Kaiserhof Hotel, as Gustav Krupp raises his wineglass in a toast to European stability, he is celebrating something far more radical than his guests imagine. They believe they are simply wealthy men protecting their interests. In reality, they have invented a form of power that operates independently of political systems, a deep state that profits from both democracy and fascism because it recognizes them as different faces of the same underlying structure. The waiter who refills their glasses will later tell his wife about the strange conversation he overheard. "It does not matter who wins the elections," one industrialist said to another, "we have already won the economy." Vienna, November 1929. The crystal chandeliers of the Palais Rothschild cast dancing shadows across mahogany conference tables as Europe's banking elite convenes for what the public believes is a routine monetary policy meeting. Baron Louis de Rothschild adjusts his wire-rimmed spectacles and surveys the 28 faces around him, men who collectively control more liquid capital than most national treasuries. But this gathering has nothing to do with conventional banking. They are here to discuss what Rothschild privately calls political arbitrage, the art of profiting from the planned obsolescence of democratic governments. 3 weeks earlier, the New York Stock Exchange has collapsed, sending shockwaves across the Atlantic that these men not only anticipated but carefully orchestrated. Through a labyrinthine network of shell companies, currency swaps, and what economists will later term structured derivative instruments, they have positioned themselves to profit from the very chaos that will destroy millions of middle-class fortunes. Yet their greatest innovation is not financial but psychological. They have discovered how to make democracy and fascism appear as opposing forces while secretly ensuring that both serve identical economic masters. The minutes from this meeting, discovered in 1973 during the renovation of a bombed Vienna office building, reveal a conversation that would make Machiavelli blush. "The beauty of our position," Rothschild tells his colleagues, "is that we need not choose between political systems. We simply ensure that all political systems choose us." But how did these men develop such sophisticated techniques for manipulating entire nations? The answer lies in a series of financial experiments conducted during the early 1920s, when traditional banking was transformed into something far more sinister. Consider the case of Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England from 1920 to 1944. Norman appears in history books as a conservative monetary policy expert, a defender of the gold standard, a pillar of British respectability. Yet his private papers, sealed until 1994, tell a radically different story. Norman has spent the 1920s developing what he calls crisis capitalism, a system designed to generate artificial economic emergencies that require predetermined solutions. The technique works like this. Norman's bank extends massive loans to unstable governments, then gradually restricts the money supply until these governments face manufactured crises. At precisely the right moment, Norman offers rescue packages that come with specific political conditions. The borrowing nations must accept Norman's choice of economic advisors, his preferred trade policies, and most importantly his candidates for key government positions. Democracy continues to function on the surface, but the actual decision-makers answer to London banks rather than local voters. By 1928, Norman has successfully tested this system in Poland, Hungary, Austria, and Germany. Each government maintains the appearance of sovereignty while surrendering actual control over economic policy. But Norman's masterstroke comes when he realizes that the same technique works equally well with fascist movements. When Mussolini rises to power in Italy, Norman simply redirects his financial support from Italian democratic parties to Mussolini's regime. The economic control mechanisms remain identical, only the political theater changes. This discovery triggers what financial historians call the Great Convergence of the late 1920s. Across Europe, banking networks begin treating democracy and fascism as interchangeable management styles for the same underlying economic system. In Germany, the Deutsche Bank simultaneously finances both Heinrich Brüning's democratic government and Hitler's early Nazi organizations. In France, the Banque de France extends credit to both socialist politicians and right-wing paramilitaries. The bankers do not care about ideology, they care about control. The most chilling example comes from Hungary, where the brilliant economist and future Nazi collaborator Ferenc Sorin develops what he calls the ideological hedge. Sorin's steel and mining empire provides funding for 3 separate political movements: the Democratic Social Democrats, the conservative Bethlen government, and the fascist Arrow Cross Party. No matter which faction eventually gains power, Sorin's industrial interests remain protected. But Sorin goes further than mere financial hedging. He actively fosters conflict between these groups, understanding that political instability increases his leverage over all of them. The democratic parties fight for voters, Sorin writes in a 1929 memorandum to his board of directors. The fascist parties fight for racial purity, but both groups fight for our money, and money always wins. This strategy proves so successful that it spreads rapidly across Central Europe. In Poland, the Gdansk banker Max Warburg simultaneously finances both Pilsudski's authoritarian government and the nascent Polish fascist movement. In Romania, the wealthy Jewish industrialist Max Auschnitt provides funds for both democratic politicians and the Iron Guard, a violently anti-Semitic organization that wants him dead. The apparent contradiction dissolves when one understands that Auschnitt profits from the ethnic tensions his funding creates. Anti-Semitic violence drives Jewish businesses to consolidate under his protection, while democratic politicians offer him security guarantees in exchange for his financial support. Perhaps the most sophisticated practitioner of this strategy is the mysterious Czech-Austrian financier Arthur Krupp, whose relationship to the better-known Gustav Krupp remains unclear. Arthur Krupp operates something unprecedented in European history, a truly transnational financial network that operates independently of any government. Through a maze of Swiss banks, Dutch holding companies, and Luxembourg investment vehicles, Krupp channels money to political movements across a dozen countries simultaneously. But Krupp's genius lies not in the complexity of his financial arrangements, but in their simplicity. He has discovered that both democratic and fascist politicians share one crucial weakness: they all need money for propaganda. Whether the message calls for racial tolerance or racial purity matters less than the fact that both messages require newspapers, radio broadcasts, rally venues, and campaign workers. Krupp provides the funding for both types of propaganda, ensuring that he profits regardless of which message ultimately prevails. By 1930, Krupp's network controls major newspapers in 7 European countries. His editors receive weekly instructions about which stories to emphasize, but these instructions are carefully crafted to appear ideologically neutral. A conservative paper might run headlines about communist threats, while a liberal paper focuses on fascist violence. But both papers promote policies that benefit Krupp's investments. The political content varies, but the economic subtext remains constant: market deregulation, reduced corporate taxation, and weaker labor unions. The ultimate test of this system comes in September 1930, when the German elections produce a fragmented parliament with no clear majority. The democratic parties hold 95 seats, the communists control 77, and the Nazis win 107. Traditional political analysis suggests this represents ideological deadlock. But Krupp and his associates see opportunity. They have financial leverage over all 3 factions and can therefore orchestrate the precise combination of cooperation and conflict that best serves their interests. Over the following months, Krupp's money flows to all sides with surgical precision. Democratic politicians receive funds to oppose both communists and Nazis. Communist organizers get money to fight both Democrats and fascists. Nazi paramilitaries are financed to attack both communist and democratic opponents. The result is precisely calibrated chaos that weakens all political movements while strengthening the financial networks that fund them. But the true elegance of this strategy only becomes apparent when one realizes its ultimate goal: not the victory of any particular ideology, but the obsolescence of ideology itself. When political movements exhaust themselves fighting each other, economic power can operate without political interference. Democracy becomes irrelevant because democratic politicians control nothing important. Fascism becomes irrelevant because fascist leaders depend entirely on their financial backers. The system continues regardless of which political faction temporarily occupies government offices. In the Palais Rothschild, as November the snow begins to fall outside the tall windows, Baron Louis raises his champagne glass one final time. "Gentlemen," he says, "we have achieved something remarkable. We have made politics optional." The men around the table smile and nod, but none of them fully comprehends what they have created. They believe they are simply intelligent businessmen protecting their investments. In reality, they have invented a form of power that will outlive every political system of their era, a deep state that operates through financial markets rather than military force, through debt rather than propaganda, through carefully managed chaos rather than obvious control. Munich, October 1932. The Odeon Theater's red velvet seats accommodate Bavaria's most distinguished guests for what the program lists as a cultural appreciation evening. Orchestra members tune their instruments while elegantly dressed patrons examine programs printed on expensive paper. But this performance has nothing to do with Wagner or Mozart. Hidden in private boxes above the main floor, 6 of Germany's most powerful industrialists prepare to witness something unprecedented: the live auction of a democratic government. Fritz Thyssen adjusts his opera glasses and surveys the crowd below. As owner of Germany's largest steel conglomerate, Thyssen controls factories that employ over 200,000 workers across the Ruhr Valley. Tonight, however, he is not here as an industrialist, but as what his associates privately call a political venture capitalist. a new breed of financier who treats ideologies like stock portfolios, buying and selling political movements based purely on their profit potential. The auction itself unfolds with theatrical precision. Representatives of three political factions, the Social Democrats, the Communists, and the rising Nazi Party, take turns presenting their platforms to the assembled businessmen. Each group promises to serve industrial interests, but the bidding war that follows reveals something far more sinister than simple corruption. These men are not buying political favors. They are purchasing the right to determine which crisis will destabilize German society next. But why would successful businessmen deliberately seek to create chaos? The answer lies in a financial innovation that historians will later call disaster derivatives, investment instruments designed to profit from social breakdown rather than economic growth. The technique works through a sophisticated understanding of what economists term volatility arbitrage. While ordinary investors lose money during political upheavals, these men have developed methods for converting instability itself into liquid capital. Consider the case of Hugo Stinnes, whose mining empire extends from the Rhine to the Czech border. Stinnes has spent the past 3 years systematically investing in both communist labor organizers and Nazi paramilitaries. Not because he supports either ideology, but because conflict between these groups creates predictable market opportunities. When communist strikes shut down his competitors' factories, Stinnes' facilities continue operating under Nazi protection. When Nazi violence triggers communist retaliation, Stinnes' warehouses become essential supply depots for both sides. Political chaos becomes his competitive advantage. The mathematics of this strategy are surprisingly simple. Traditional capitalism requires stable markets, predictable contracts, and enforceable property rights. But crisis capitalism operates through what Stinnes calls productive disruption, the systematic creation of problems that only capital-intensive solutions can solve. The greater the social breakdown, the more desperately governments need private resources to maintain order. Democracy becomes expensive. Fascism offers efficiency. But the choice between political systems matters less than ensuring that both systems depend entirely on private financing. At the Munich auction, the bidding reveals the sophisticated choreography behind Germany's political crisis. The Social Democrats receive funding to organize massive unemployment rallies, which create public pressure for government intervention. The Communists get money to stage factory occupations, which justify police crackdowns that benefit security contractors. The Nazis obtain resources for street demonstrations that terrorize middle-class voters into supporting authoritarian solutions. Each group believes it is fighting for ideological principles, but all three are unknowingly performing in a carefully scripted drama designed to exhaust democratic institutions. The true genius of this system becomes apparent when one examines its international dimensions. The same financial networks that orchestrate German political chaos simultaneously manipulate democratic breakdowns across Europe. In Spain, the banker Juan March finances both Republican politicians and fascist generals, ensuring that the inevitable civil war will require massive reconstruction loans that only his banks can provide. In France, the Comité des Forges simultaneously funds socialist newspapers and right-wing paramilitaries, creating the polarization that will eventually justify Vichy collaboration. But perhaps the most sophisticated example comes from Hungary, where the mysterious financier Baron Manfred Weiss has perfected what he calls ethnic arbitrage, the art of profiting from deliberately engineered ethnic conflicts. Weiss's strategy works through a complex understanding of how democratic societies respond to minority threats. By secretly funding both Hungarian nationalist movements and Jewish self-defense organizations, Weiss creates the ethnic tensions that justify increasingly authoritarian government responses. The process unfolds with mathematical precision. Weiss's agents provocateurs stage anti-Semitic incidents that terrorize Jewish communities into seeking protection from his security companies. Simultaneously, his newspapers publish inflammatory articles about Jewish economic influence that radicalize Hungarian nationalists. As ethnic violence escalates, democratic politicians lose credibility for failing to maintain order, while authoritarian alternatives gain support by promising decisive action. Both Jewish communities and Hungarian nationalists end up financially dependent on Weiss's enterprises, while democracy collapses under the weight of conflicts that Weiss himself has manufactured. By 1933, this strategy has produced what intelligence analysts call coordinated democratic failure across Central Europe. 9 different democratic governments have collapsed within 18 months, but the same financial networks profit from each breakdown. The Polish government falls after ethnic riots between Poles and Germans, both funded by the same Berlin banks. The Austrian parliament dissolves following conflicts between Social Democrats and Christian Socialists, both receiving money from identical Viennese investment houses. The Romanian democracy collapses during fights between liberals and fascists, both dependent on loans from Hungarian financiers. Most observers interpret these events as evidence of democracy's inherent instability during economic crises. But confidential documents discovered after World War II reveal a different pattern entirely. The same men who publicly lament democracy's weakness have privately engineered its destruction through the systematic funding of incompatible political movements. They have not simply adapted to democratic failure. They have manufactured it as a profitable business model. The technique reaches its most sophisticated expression in Germany, where the Nazi rise to power appears to result from popular anger and economic desperation, but actually follows a financial script written by men who profit equally from democratic breakdown and fascist consolidation. Hitler's success depends not on ideological appeal, but on a carefully orchestrated bankruptcy of democratic alternatives. By the time ordinary Germans recognize the manipulation, the democratic institutions that might resist it have already been financially strangled. In the Munich theater, as the final curtain falls and the audience begins to disperse, Fritz Thyssen approaches his colleague Gustav Krupp with a satisfied smile. "Democracy is finished," he whispers. "But business," Krupp replies, "business has never been better." The two men shake hands and walk toward their waiting cars, unaware that they have just witnessed the premiere performance of what will become the 20th century's most successful business model, the conversion of political systems into profit-generating entertainment. They believe they are simply protecting their investments during turbulent times. In reality, they have discovered how to make turbulence itself the foundation of a new form of capitalism that operates independently of political systems because it has learned to consume them. Outside the theater, snow begins to fall on the Munich streets, where ordinary citizens hurry home, unaware that their democracy has just been auctioned to the highest bidder. They still believe in elections, political parties, and constitutional rights. But inside the Odeon Theater, those concepts have already become historical curiosities, quaint artifacts from an era when political systems actually controlled economic ones rather than serving as their disposable entertainment. Prague, January 1934. The Baroque halls of Wenceslas Palace echo with the measured footsteps of men who control the economic destiny of Central Europe, yet their names appear in no government directory. Their decisions require no parliamentary approval. 22 financiers, industrialists, and what intelligence reports will later classify as transnational economic operatives have gathered for what their secretaries describe as a monetary policy symposium. But the leather portfolios they carry contain no currency charts or trade statistics. Instead, these men have come to Prague to finalize something unprecedented in European history, the systematic conversion of human suffering into industrial raw material. The architect of this gathering is Dr. Hermann Schmitz, managing director of the German chemical giant IG Farben, whose laboratories stretch from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Schmitz appears in newspaper photographs as a distinguished scientist, a champion of German industrial innovation, a patriotic defender of European civilization. Yet the confidential documents spread across the Prague conference table tell a dramatically different story. Schmitz has spent the past 18 months developing what he privately calls crisis farming, the deliberate cultivation of social disasters that can be harvested for extraordinary profits. The technique works through sophisticated manipulation of what economists term psychological market dynamics. Traditional capitalism depends on consumer confidence, political stability, and predictable social relationships. But Schmitz has discovered that certain types of businesses actually thrive during periods of extreme social breakdown. Prison construction companies profit from rising crime rates. Security firms benefit from ethnic violence. Medical supply corporations gain from epidemic diseases. Armament manufacturers require international tensions. The key insight is not simply to profit from existing crises, but to systematically manufacture the crises that generate these profits. At the Prague conference, Schmitz unveils the results of his pilot program in Germany, where his network has spent 3 years testing the commercial viability of engineered social chaos. The statistics he presents would make Machiavelli envious for their cold precision. By simultaneously financing communist labor organizers and Nazi paramilitaries, Schmitz has increased industrial accidents by 47%, creating massive demand for his chemical safety equipment. By funding both Jewish self-defense groups and anti-Semitic publications, he has generated enough ethnic tension to justify the construction of segregated housing projects that his construction subsidiaries built at premium prices. But Schmidt's masterstroke involves what he calls ideological manufacturing. Rather than simply exploiting existing political movements, his network has learned to create entirely artificial ideologies designed specifically to generate profitable conflicts. The process begins with careful psychological research into the fears and resentments of different social groups. Professional agitators are then deployed to transform these emotions into organized political movements that appear to emerge organically but actually follow predetermined scripts. Consider the case of the Hungarian Christian defense movement, which appears to be a spontaneous religious reaction against communist infiltration. In reality, Schmidt's psychological experts have crafted this movement using scientific techniques developed by his subsidiary companies. The movement's propaganda appeals to genuine religious sentiment, but its actual political positions are designed to benefit Schmidt's industrial interests. The movement opposes labor unions that might interfere with his factories, supports trade policies that benefit his export business, and advocates for military spending that increases demand for his chemical products. The genius of this approach lies in its emotional authenticity, combined with its economic instrumentality. The Christian defense movement's members genuinely believe they are fighting for religious values against godless communism. Their feelings are real, their sacrifices are meaningful, their dedication is admirable. But their movement serves as an unconscious vehicle for advancing the commercial interests of men who care nothing about religion, nationalism, or any ideology beyond profit maximization. Schmidt's Prague presentation includes detailed financial projections that demonstrate the scalability of this model across Europe. In Poland, his agents have successfully created artificial tensions between Catholics and Orthodox Christians that justify massive church construction projects funded by his financial subsidiaries. In Romania, engineered conflicts between ethnic Romanians and Hungarian minorities have created demand for his security services and surveillance equipment. In Yugoslavia, deliberately fostered disputes between Serbs and Croats have generated lucrative opportunities for his mediation and reconstruction companies. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Schmidt's system is its treatment of democratic institutions not as obstacles to overcome, but as tools to exploit. Democratic societies, Schmidt explains to his Prague audience, are particularly vulnerable to manufactured consent because they depend on public opinion, which can be systematically engineered through scientific propaganda techniques. The process requires no violation of democratic procedures, only the patient manipulation of the information environment that shapes democratic choices. The method works through what Schmidt calls triangulated manipulation. His network simultaneously funds 3 different types of political organizations: moderate democratic parties that appeal to voters seeking stability, radical movements that attract citizens frustrated with moderate politics, and extremist groups that terrify the middle class into supporting authoritarian solutions. Each category serves a specific function in generating the controlled chaos that his businesses require. The moderate parties receive funding to promote policies that appear reasonable but actually serve industrial interests. They advocate for balanced labor relations that favor management, responsible environmental policies that allow continued pollution, and pragmatic foreign policies that benefit arms manufacturers. These parties provide democratic legitimacy for policies that would be rejected if their true purpose were understood. The radical movements get money to stage dramatic protests and confrontations that discredit peaceful democratic processes. Their activities create public demand for law and order solutions that inevitably involve increased spending on security services, prison construction, and surveillance technology, all sectors where Schmidt's network maintains significant investments. The radicals believe they are fighting for social justice, but their tactics inadvertently strengthen the authoritarian systems they claim to oppose. The extremist groups receive financing to commit acts of violence and terrorism that justify the dismantling of civil liberties and democratic protections. Their crimes create the atmosphere of crisis that allows exceptional measures to become permanent institutions. Most importantly, extremist violence provides the emotional justification for population control technologies that can later be deployed against any group that threatens established economic interests. By the end of 1934, Schmidt's system has been successfully tested in 7 European countries. Democratic institutions continue to function in all these nations, but the actual decision-making power has been quietly transferred to networks of private economic actors who operate through controlled opposition movements rather than direct political control. Elections still occur, but all viable candidates depend on funding from the same financial sources. Parliamentary debates continue, but the range of acceptable policy options has been narrowed to choices that serve identical economic interests regardless of their ideological packaging. The ultimate refinement of this system comes when Schmitz realizes that the same techniques work equally well with fascist movements. The Nazi Party's rise to power appears to represent the triumph of radical ideology over democratic institutions, but Schmitz's private correspondence reveals a different interpretation entirely. The Nazis succeed not because they destroy democracy, but because they perfect the manipulation techniques that his network has been developing for years. Hitler's regime operates through the same triangulated manipulation that Schmitz pioneered in democratic countries, except that fascist methods are more efficient because they eliminate the need to maintain multiple competing organizations. Instead of funding both communist and anti-communist movements, the Nazi state simply assigns different bureaucratic agencies to generate the controlled conflicts that private industry requires. The SS creates security crises that benefit security contractors. The Gestapo generates surveillance demands that profit technology companies. The Wehrmacht produces military tensions that enrich armament manufacturers. In the Prague Palace, as January snow continues to fall outside the tall windows, Dr. Schmitz raises his wine glass in a final toast to his assembled colleagues. "Gentlemen," he announces, "we have achieved something that no previous generation could have imagined. We have made human nature itself our raw material." The men around the table nod and smile, but few of them comprehend the full implications of what they have accomplished. They believe they are simply sophisticated businessmen who have learned to profit from political instability. In reality, they have invented a form of capitalism that operates by consuming the social foundations upon which capitalism itself depends. A machine that generates profits by destroying the communities, relationships, and institutions that make human society possible. Outside the palace walls, ordinary Czech citizens go about their daily lives, unaware that their emotions, their fears, their hopes and their hatreds have become industrial inputs in a manufacturing process designed to convert human suffering into private wealth. They still believe in political parties, national identities, and ideological principles. But inside the Wenceslas Palace, those concepts have been revealed as products manufactured by techniques as systematic and scientific as any other form of industrial production. Geneva, March 1938. The Hôtel des Bergues stands majestically on the shores of Lake Geneva, its windows reflecting the snow-capped Alps, while inside its opulent conference rooms the final acts of European democracy's transformation play out in whispered conversations between men who control more capital than most sovereign nations. 29 industrialists, bankers, and economic strategists have gathered under the pretense of a League of Nations Economic Advisory Committee meeting. But the briefing papers spread across mahogany conference tables tell a radically different story. These men have come to Geneva to witness and finalize what their private correspondence calls the Convergence Protocol, the successful transformation of both democratic and fascist political systems into efficient management tools for transnational capital. The architect of this gathering is the enigmatic Swiss financier Martin Bodmer, whose banking empire stretches from Zurich to Constantinople, from Stockholm to Barcelona. Bodmer appears in public as a respectable supporter of international cooperation, a patron of democratic institutions, a defender of League of Nations principles. Yet the classified documents he presents to his Geneva audience reveal something unprecedented in European history, a comprehensive system for converting human civilization itself into a profit-generating mechanism that operates independently of political systems, ideological commitments, or national boundaries. The evidence Bodmer presents is overwhelming in its scope and chilling in its implications. Over the past decade, his network has successfully tested techniques for manipulating democratic institutions, fascist movements, communist organizations, and nationalist uprisings across 17 different countries. The results demonstrate that all political systems, regardless of their ideological content, can be transformed into vehicles for advancing identical economic interests through the systematic application of what Bodmer calls universal control mathematics. The technique works through sophisticated manipulation of what economists term systemic dependencies. Every political movement, whether democratic or totalitarian, requires the same basic resources: money for propaganda, weapons for enforcement, food for supporters, communication networks for coordination, and transportation for logistics. By gaining control over these fundamental resources through seemingly separate financial institutions, Bodmer's network can direct the behavior of any political system without directly controlling its leadership or openly violating its ideological principles. Consider the case of Spain, where Bodmer's agents have spent 3 years orchestrating what appears to be a spontaneous civil war between competing ideological factions. The conflict began in July 1936 with what most observers interpreted as a military uprising against the democratically elected Popular Front government. But Bodmer's private records reveal a dramatically different story. Both the Republican and nationalist sides have been receiving financing, weapons, and strategic guidance from subsidiaries of the same Swiss banking consortium. The Spanish Civil War serves as Bodmer's most sophisticated experiment in controlled conflict optimization. By simultaneously funding both sides of the conflict, his network has created a laboratory for testing advanced techniques for converting human suffering into industrial raw materials. The war generates massive demand for armaments, medical supplies, reconstruction materials, refugee services, and financial aid, all sectors where Bodmer maintains controlling interests. More importantly, the conflict provides cover for the systematic elimination of political leaders, union organizers, and intellectuals who might otherwise resist the post-war implementation of economic policies that serve transnational rather than national interests. But Bodmer's Spanish experiment reveals something even more sophisticated than simple war profiteering. Through careful analysis of propaganda effectiveness, battlefield logistics, and refugee population movements, his agents have developed mathematical models for predicting and controlling the behavior of entire societies during periods of extreme stress. These models demonstrate that human beings respond to crisis conditions in surprisingly predictable patterns that can be exploited for economic advantage through the precise timing of resource allocation and information distribution. The Geneva presentation includes detailed case studies from Germany, where Bodmer's network has successfully transformed the Nazi regime from a chaotic ideological movement into an efficient mechanism for advancing precisely the same economic policies that his agents had previously promoted through democratic institutions. The transformation required no change in Nazi propaganda, no modification of Hitler's personal beliefs, and no alteration of the party's public positions. Instead, Bodmer's agents simply ensured that every policy option presented to Nazi leadership served the financial interests of transnational capital while maintaining the appearance of ideological consistency. The process works through what Bodmer calls choice architecture. Nazi officials believe they are making independent decisions based on ideological principles, but the information they receive, the experts who advise them, and the policy options available to them have all been carefully engineered to produce predetermined outcomes. Hitler continues to deliver passionate speeches about German nationalism and racial purity, but every specific policy his government implements, from autarky programs to rearmament spending to territorial expansion, benefits the same international financial networks that previously profited from Weimar democracy. Perhaps most remarkably, Bodmer's Geneva audience learns that identical techniques have been successfully deployed in the Soviet Union, where Stalin's government appears to represent the absolute opposite of fascist ideology, but actually serves similar economic functions for transnational capital. Through a complex network of trade agreements, industrial partnerships, and financial instruments, Bodmer's agents have ensured that Soviet economic policies generate profitable opportunities for Western corporations while maintaining the appearance of ideological independence. The key insight is that communist, fascist, and democratic governments all require the same types of industrial production: steel for infrastructure, chemicals for agriculture, machinery for manufacturing, and technology for communication. By controlling the companies that provide these essential resources, Bodmer's network can influence government behavior regardless of political ideology. Soviet five-year plans, Nazi autarky programs, and democratic market regulation all become different methods for implementing identical industrial policies that serve the same transnational economic interests. By March 1938, Bodmer's system has achieved what he privately calls ideological transcendence, the creation of economic control mechanisms that operate independently of political beliefs, national loyalties, or cultural differences. Democratic politicians continue to speak about freedom and constitutional rights. Fascist leaders continue to promote nationalism and racial ideology. Communist officials continue to advocate for workers' revolution and collective ownership. But beneath these ideological differences, all three systems have been quietly transformed into administrative units for managing the same global economic structure. The ultimate test of this system comes when Bodmer's agents successfully orchestrate coordinated policy changes across multiple countries with opposing political systems. In September 1938, the Munich Agreement appears to result from complex diplomatic negotiations between democratic and fascist governments. But Bodmer's private correspondence reveals that the agreement actually implements a predetermined economic strategy designed to benefit specific industrial sectors regardless of its political consequences. The Munich crisis serves multiple functions simultaneously. It increases demand for military equipment that Bodmer's companies manufacture. It creates refugee populations that require services his humanitarian organizations provide. It justifies expanded government spending that benefits his financial institutions, and it establishes precedents for territorial reorganization that will later facilitate his post-war economic reconstruction projects. Most importantly, the crisis demonstrates that democratic and fascist governments can be manipulated into implementing identical policies through the careful orchestration of apparently opposing ideological pressures. In the Hôtel des Bergues, as March snow continues to fall outside the tall windows overlooking Lake Geneva, Martin Bodmer raises his crystal wine glass in a final toast to his assembled colleagues. "Gentlemen," he announces, "we have achieved something that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. We have made ideology itself obsolete." The men around the conference table nod and smile, but few of them fully comprehend the magnitude of what they have accomplished. They believe they are simply successful businessmen who have learned to profit from political instability and international conflict. In reality, they have invented a form of economic organization that consumes political systems as raw material for generating private wealth, a machine that transforms human societies into disposable components in a manufacturing process designed to concentrate capital in the hands of transnational networks that operate beyond the reach of any democratic institution, fascist regime, or communist revolution. Outside the hotel windows, ordinary Swiss citizens walk along the Geneva lakefront, unaware that their democracy, like every other political system in Europe, has been quietly transformed into a subsidiary of economic interests that recognize no national boundaries, respect no ideological principles, and acknowledge no accountability to human communities. They still believe in elections, political parties, and constitutional governments. But inside the Hôtel des Bergues, those concepts have been revealed as historical curiosities from an era when political systems actually controlled economic ones rather than serving as their temporary costumes. The deep state has finally achieved its ultimate form, not as a hidden conspiracy within government, but as the transformation of government itself into a mechanism for serving interests that transcend all political boundaries, ideological commitments, and human loyalties. Democracy and fascism have converged not through the victory of one ideology over another, but through their mutual absorption into an economic system that treats all political forms as interchangeable tools for advancing identical financial objectives. The men who created this system believed they were simply protecting their investments during turbulent times. Instead, they have engineered the end of politics itself, the replacement of human governance with algorithmic resource allocation designed to optimize profit extraction from human civilization. The shadow network that emerged in smoky Berlin hotels has become the only political reality that matters, while everything else, elections, ideologies, nations, and democracies are made diamond, has been reduced to theatrical entertainment designed to distract populations from recognizing their transformation into industrial inputs.